Forward and back. It was fortuitous, to say the least, that only 4 months before the flood, the Oregon legislature had created the Oregon State Board of Health, the first agency tasked with supervising public health in the state's history. And it may have been equally important that the board convened its second quarterly meeting roughly 40 hours after the Heppner Flood. Failing sanitation and the threat of disease hung over the Willow Creek Valley. The Board of Health, meeting in Portland June 16th, appointed Dr. C.J. Smith of Pendleton to go to Heppner to visit the seat of the disaster and take such steps to protect the health of the survivors as seemed to him advisable. The board, just then setting up systems and procedures, had more than Heppner to think about. Because the bubonic plague had broken out in San Francisco, the board decided on steps to prevent the plague in Portland, primarily by destroying rats on its wharves. A smallpox epidemic had killed 17 people in Central Oregon in late April. The public health officers were also investigating water supplies and sewerage throughout the state, particularly where state institutions, including the state penitentiary and the state insane asylum, had recently seen epidemics of typhoid fever. C.J. Smith would arrive in Heppner Thursday night. Before then, he spoke by telegram or telephone with Morrow County physician Dr. Frank B. Kistner, perhaps with Dr. K.A.J. McKenzie, the chief surgeon of the ORNN, who was in Heppner, and almost certainly with Frank Gillum. By Wednesday, at someone's direction, workmen around Heppner began pulling the carcasses of animals from the drifts and dragging them into piles. Using lumber and driftwood left by the flood, they burned the animal remains. The stench was terrible, of course, but perhaps it was no worse than the aroma of barnyard and organic rot that had permeated the whole scene since Sunday night. When Smith got to Heppner Thursday night, he found the conditions greatly in need of someone with authority to straighten out the sanitation of the place. The legislation creating the state board assigned county physicians the duties of collecting and submitting records on communicable diseases and the deaths they caused, and ordered quarantines. First, Smith assigned workmen to build enough privies to serve the hundreds of workers laboring in Heppner. To head off cholera, he got everyone drinking only water mixed with sulfuric acid. Then, with the leaders of relief teams from Portland and Pendleton, he established a system. As soon as a drift was searched for human bodies, the debris was to be piled up and burned. Burning the animals' remains and debris was not without risk. Until the municipal water system was fully back in business, those fires could spread to buildings spared by the flood, and the community wouldn't have had the means to stop them. Heppner already had one advantage its local citizens could not have anticipated. When they had voted to tax themselves for a municipal water system 11 years earlier, they retired the use of individual wells. The threat of typhoid after the flood was not so severe in Heppner because people didn't get their drinking water from wells fouled by the floodwaters. But downstream, drinking water still came from family wells. All that apparently useless alkali soil stretching north from Heppner also turned out to be a godsend. Because the soil contained caustic potash and soda, Smith knew it was a disinfectant and deodorizer. He ordered all the contaminated mud shoveled into wagons and carried away from Heppner's surface soil and cesspools, and alkali hauled in to cover the places it had been. After surface drains were cleaned out and cellars pumped, alkali was also spread over them. Smith announced Saturday, "The town will be thoroughly cleaned by Wednesday. All depends on keeping an efficient force at work." Human bodies were getting harder and harder to extricate. J.H. Gwynn, a Knights of Pythias representative visiting Heppner, later described a typical scene. An arm was found protruding from the debris, and a force of men was put to work. With 20 men and 4 horses, it took 2 hours and a half for the rubbish to be torn away so that the body could be reached. Since Sunday, the sun had been baking the mud in the drifts, and it hardened like concrete. That was one reason leaders of the work crews and the executive committee were about to end the formal search for bodies. A really thorough search would require a tedious and not necessarily productive combing through every drift. Instead, the plan was to have workers examine drifts and other areas when odor or some other clue indicated a body could be found there. As bad as it was, the combination of hot afternoons and human bodies waiting to be found was not as awful as it might have been. The storm that brought all this unspeakable sorrow had at the same time given survivors a gift. Clear ice hail does not melt so quickly as typical layered hailstones. Some bodies of the flood victims were still encased in ice as late as Friday. 5 days out, USGS engineer John Whistler picked up a random handful of hailstones and measured one that was still 5/8 of an inch by 7/16 of an inch. The beds of hail were themselves covered with silt and debris. Those bodies preserved in ice were less terrible to handle and more likely to be identified. Of course, the hail was very much a mixed blessing. It saved Heppner even more grief in working with the remains, but, like the baked clay mud, it weighed down and held fast huge tangles of debris workmen needed to pull apart. The men from Sumter and Baker City, who had impressed everyone with their organization and hard work, headed home Saturday, June 20th. They were succeeded, said the Portland Oregonian, on June 21st by 78 sturdy men and 14 strong, capable women from Pendleton. The women would take the place of women workers here who are now on the verge of collapse from the physical and emotional overstraining. Because the task facing Heppner Sunday night must have seemed overwhelming, signs of progress would have been vital to the collective mood. People must have recognized some important milestones. Thursday, nearly 20 caskets were waiting at the depot to be shipped out to other towns across the country. 2 big freight trains filled with wool arrived from inland points that day, symbolizing the resumption of business. Friday, the OR&N crew working on a bridge north of Heppner found 4 bodies in a culvert. About 100 men in 3 parties were searching the valley north of Heppner. Saturday, the city water system, including connections to the reservoir used exclusively for firefighting, was fully repaired. Saturday night, the first regularly scheduled train got all the way to Heppner. This greatly eased the difficulty of receiving help and supplies, and made it seem possible to take a vacation from the sorrow. Winnie Shutt, wife of Sheriff Shutt, and their blind son Lawrence were on that train. They had started for home from Chicago as soon as they heard about the flood, but Winnie did not know until they got to Spokane that her husband and daughter were safe. Sunday was 1 week after the flood. A day of gloom in this town of destruction, said the Portland, Oregon Journal. A week ago, people would say, and as the time approached that fatal 5:30 o'clock, a feeling of awe took possession of the hundreds who were still working in the piles of debris below town, took possession of the many who were caring for the destitute and the destitute themselves. But the day passed without other incident than steady work from morning until night, which resulted in finding 2 more bodies. 10 days later came the most significant juncture. On July 1st, due largely to an extraordinary leg up from the people of the Northwest and elsewhere, Heppner was getting ready to rely solely on herself. As much as the town had needed the help, it was time for the community to pick up the rest of the cleanup and the money that went with it. When the Eastern Oregon truck farming community of Milton sent Heppner enough green vegetables to nearly fill a train car, it was said workers were eating a ton of provisions every day. Despite such generosity for all the hourly pay and the workers' food and supplies, the executive committee was nevertheless spending $1,620, in 2007 dollars about $38,000 a day. Once contributions for wages and groceries started going entirely to people in and around Heppner, that would be another step toward recovery. Hundreds of people had lost everything. Farmers and ranchers had seen their future incomes disappear under water and slime. Some employers were destroyed, others disrupted. Local citizens could use the money. Also, and this might be more important, The more Heppner could do for herself, the better it would be for the self-image of a town that loved independence. The individualists in Heppner had long practiced shaking off adversity, picking up the pieces, and marching forward. This would be the natural course of things. Cleanup would require restructuring anyway. Hay was ready for cutting, and the wheat harvest loomed. Men and their teams needed to get back to their pre-flood duties. The Portland workers took the train home July 1st, and the executive committee did not seek replacements. The last flood victim's body, found in 1903, was discovered that day in a pool of water 2 miles north of Heppner. It was Ida B. Andrews, age 30, daughter of George and Mildred Swaggart, mother of Mabel, Vashti, and Annie Clare, sister of Iva Beard. The town of Heppner was largely cleaned up, and the drifts snaking down the valley could get less immediate attention. The remaining Pendleton workers were heading back after July 4th, leaving about 50 local men working on cleanup. The public health concerns in Heppner had been resolved after a week. What sanitation measures were taken or health instructions given to Lexington and Ione remained the biggest puzzle of the Heppner Flood. Smith had reportedly deputized a man to take charge of sanitation in Lexington, and a physician in Ione had agreed to perform that service in his town. 2 days after the flood, John McAllister of Lexington had reported that the doctors say all dead cattle must be burned and drinking water boiled to prevent the spread of sickness. But minutes of the State Board of Health meeting December 22, 1903, say Smith had not been able to extend the same sanitation measures to Lexington and Ione because he couldn't get the money from the Heppner Relief Committee. That makes no sense. The Heppner Committee provided help to 13 people in Lexington and 10 to Ione. J.N. Teal of the Portland Relief Effort found destitute people in Lexington and provided them aid. Lexington itself had a relief fund which had collected more than $1,000. If nothing else, enlightened self-interest would have dictated that Heppner help prevent disease in Lexington and Ione. The legislature allocated the State Board of Health $5,000 a year, about $120,000 in 2007 dollars, for the secretary's salary and board members' travel expenses. Is it possible that vulnerable towns were required to find the money for sanitation or do without? In its first biennial report on January 1, 1905, the Board of Health contrasted the protection provided Heppner and not provided Lexington and Ione to make the point that public health measures are worth the money. The report said Smith devoted 2 weeks, being particularly careful to insist upon the cleaning out of all cellars under houses, their disinfection with alkali from the surrounding deserts, and the thorough destruction of putrescible animal and vegetable remains. When Heppner had been placed in sanitary condition, he prepared to devote his attention to Ione and Lexington, but was prevented from doing so from an inability to secure funds for the purpose. Whatever the reason, sanitation measures were insufficient in Lexington and Ione, and the failure to anticipate or overcome the problem was a dangerous gamble. Loss and optimism. The probate and guardianship records that were the legal remains of the Heppner Flood are bound in enormous cloth and leather books and stored in temperature-controlled rooms in the basement of the Morrow County Courthouse in Heppner. The pages in these volumes are written by hand, page after page of legal language, every word formal, precise, legible. They carefully record the steps required to settle estates. The appointment of administrators is followed by the naming of appraisers, then perhaps by the authorization of an estate sale, and then the appointment of a guardian for surviving minors, and so on. In Morrow County Probate Journal D, where most of the flood victims' estate proceedings are recorded, one name appears at the bottom of each petition, report, order, and affidavit. Starting June 20th, 1903, Alba G. Bartholomew supervised 94 proceedings for the families of flood victims. The names are familiar: Wells, Howard, Hockett, French, Jones, Morgan, Salling, Krug, Dawson, Matlock, Roberts, Vaughn, and 33 others. Alba was in his second four-year term as Morrow County judge. It is safe to say he never had a caseload of probate and guardianship proceedings. He had not lost family in the flood, nor his home. He and his son Fred were inside the Methodist Episcopal Church South, directing the Sunday school children in a rehearsal. Alba faced having to make significant repairs to his star rooming house, but at 58 he still did not shy away from manual labor. The judge had shepherded construction of Heppner's stately new stone courthouse, and when it came time to put in the landscaping, he asked for the job and did it. 2 days after the flood, he was named to the Heppner Relief Committee and spent parts of the next 2.5 months interviewing survivors. Alba's judicial responsibilities must have been just as taxing. Both the legal and relief work involved his friends and neighbors, their children and their spouses, their parents, brothers, and sisters. Even in a county where optimism was the rule, every family that came before him was coping with sudden, inexplicable loss. On October 1st, Alba accepted a report on the sale of some of Hattie Kinsley's property, 2 cows and 2 calves that brought $70. That proceeding is on page 423 of Probate Journal D. Just below the signature of Alba G. Bartholomew is the next entry, as routine and formal as all the others. It documents the beginning of probate proceedings in the death of Alba G. Bartholomew. His last judicial acts had actually been October 20th and October 21st, appointing a guardian for 5 Ione children and appraisers for their parents' estate. Alba died November 2nd, and his November 5th obituary reported that the main cause of his death was overwork. He collapsed under the strain of his labors of attending to public and private affairs. His funeral was held on November 4th. It is probably a measure of the workload that Tom Ayers was quickly appointed to succeed him. Tom thought a while about the offer before accepting, but took the oath on November 10th. He was 63. The Heppner Gazette declared, "It is unnecessary to say that county affairs will be safe in his hands. He has always been successful with his own affairs and is a man of good judgment." Alba Bartholomew's name does not appear on any list of victims of the Heppner Flood. The speculation that his death was due to overwork argues that the flood contributed to his death. But we create a slippery slope if we add to the list of victims a man whose death was not certainly caused by the flood. How many other survivors died earlier than they would have because they witnessed the flood or its horrors? In the years after the flood, there were some quite public suicides. Did the catastrophe contribute to their loss of hope? And other people were spared on June 14th. Perhaps some of them lived longer because they felt obligated or blessed. If there had been no Heppner Flood, would Alba Bartholomew have lived longer? We cannot say. How to count the death of Mark Cargill of Pendleton poses another dilemma. The 31-year-old was killed on his way to Heppner a day after the flood. Another storm struck over eastern Oregon June 15th, creating a flash flood down Coombs Canyon west of Pendleton. Cargill may have been with several teams of men, women, and horses taking supplies to Heppner when they were caught by a cloudburst over the headwaters of Birch Creek. It is entirely possible his mission was to help Heppner, and he attempted to keep going in spite of the storm. Mark Cargill's body was found 8 miles down the canyon from where he apparently died. Was Mark Cargill a victim of the Heppner Flood? It was a different flood that killed him, and we cannot be sure he was going to Heppner's aid. Cargill's name is on the monument in the Heppner Masonic Cemetery, but this book does not include him nor Alba Bartholomew among the flood's victims. Then again, consider the 5 orphans Judge Bartholomew was supervising in his last 2 official acts. It is much easier to declare that their parents were killed by the Heppner Flood in October of 1903. Typhoid fever is caused by a bacterium, Salmonella typhi, which gets into drinking water through contaminated sewage. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website says about 400 cases show up in the U.S. every year, 3/4 of them acquired while traveling abroad. The fever is common in the developing world with a yearly death toll of about 200,000. The only way to be certain it's typhoid is a lab test, and the treatment is antibiotics. That is, today. Typhoid fever must have been common in the America of 1903. Newspapers sometimes referred to it simply as the fever. As early as August, the coming trouble, which could still have been averted, had been evident in the pages of the Gazette. August 6th, in the Lexington News column, Johnny Leach is battling with typhoid fever. August 13th, attorney S.C. Knotson is in the city, says there's much sickness in Lexington. Under Lexington News, one of W.J. Davis's little girls is quite sick. George Broadley is recovering rapidly from an attack of typhoid fever. Mrs. R.A. Nichols has been sick for several days. It is feared that the disease will prove to be typhoid fever. The floodwaters were tainted as they rolled downstream and washed bacteria into the shallow wells in Lexington, and especially in Ione. Newspaper reports imply that wells had not been completely disinfected. Between September 1903 and January 1904, the Gazette followed 18 people sickened with typhoid in those two communities. The September 24th Gazette carried this notice: died September 16th of typhoid fever, Ellen Fansett, correctly Fawcett, aged 12 years. The funeral was conducted by Reverend W.O. Miller. The remains were interred in the Lexington Cemetery. On October 19th, the Gazette reported, 3 funerals occurred in Ione yesterday: Charles Ingraham, William Hagewood, and Mr. Edward H. Fleming, all being victims of typhoid fever. The Warfield family had been farming near Ione since the patriarch Samuel Warfield moved there decades before the Heppner Flood. Sam Warfield, to white people a hero of the Indian Wars, had died in Lexington on January 27th, about 4.5 months before the Heppner Flood. Sam's youngest son, Samuel Newton Warfield, and his wife Sarah had 6 children. They had a house in Ione and a farm outside town. If school was in session in the fall of 1903, they were likely living in town. We don't know when they were exposed. The CDC says that without therapy, typhoid can last 3 or 4 weeks. The first to succumb was Samuel N. Warfield, 43, who died October 13th. Sarah died 4 days later, on October 17th at age 32. Olga, their 4-year-old, was lost on October 19th. 3 out of a family of 8, all buried in Highview Cemetery in Ione. Not far away is the grave of William Hagewood, who died of typhoid that November. Since he was married to Samuel N. Warfield's older sister, Mary, it's possible he was sickened by the same source. The typhoid victims then were Ellen Fawcett of Lexington and Ione residents Charles Ingraham, William Hagewood, and Edward Harvey Fleming, and the Warfields, Samuel N., Sarah, and Olga. One more person died much later, but apparently as a direct result of the Heppner Flood. Minnie Lade Willis was 27 years old on June 14, 1903. She and her husband James and their 3 sons lived near the depot in the north end of Heppner. Minnie Willis survived to tell her story in the Walla Walla Union. My husband, myself, and 3 children were eating supper when the rain fell so heavy that it seemed like a fog. Baby was in the high chair and he was sick. Jim decided we had better go over to Mother's, which was on high ground. We had not gotten through the garden fence when Jim called that the town was moving. I looked up and saw all the houses starting toward us. Wanting to return to the house, the 8-year-old pulled back on his mother. Jim rushed forward and threw the baby on a bank and came back to help me. He was swept away. I grabbed the second boy and clung to a railroad car. A big timber came down and struck him on the head and killed him. It hit me on the leg and nearly killed me. The oldest boy got back into the garden, which was dry. A wall of water swept round and took him after all. Alone, I was swept under the railroad cars. I had to tear my shoes off before I could rise. Getting to the warehouse platform, I pried a door open. In my desperation, I took off all my clothing and wrapped myself in wool sacks. There I lay in the cold until morning. The account continued. Wonderful to say, Mrs. Willis's baby was found lying on the bank covered with drift, but still alive. James Willis, 30, died June 14th, along with his mother, Eliza M., 58. Also lost were Frank Willis, 8, and Frederick, 6. The baby who survived was Harlan, about a year old. Gertrude Ford, a child placed with Eliza Willis by the Boys and Girls Aid Society in Portland, was also killed. All who died on June 14th were buried in Heppner Masonic Cemetery. The Heppner Times listed Minnie Willis among the injured on June 17, 1903, describing her injury as a side cut. According to Lade Family Research, Minnie and baby Harlan improved enough to go to Troy, Idaho to live with their parents, Cyrus and Elizabeth Lade, who had been residents of Morrow County in the early 1890s. Minnie died in Troy, apparently of her flood injuries, almost 2 years later, on May 26, 1905. She is buried in Spencer Cemetery off Highway 8 outside Troy. The continuing blows dealt by the flood did not deter Heppner from doing what a self-reliant town of optimists would do, rebuild as soon as possible and expecting a community better than ever. It was June 19th, 5 days after the flood, when the Portland Oregonian first mentioned these expectations. Heppner will pull itself together again, the same prolific resources that made this one of the best moneyed little towns in the state, it is believed, will construct it again. The ORNN, which had covered itself in glory from the first news of the flood and had an interest in people and industry thriving in the areas where it had tracks, announced a special rate of 1/2 upon all material to be used for rebuilding Heppner. The second edition of the Heppner Times after the flood was devoted largely to comfort and praise, and urging Heppner citizens to stay and rebuild. The paper declared both that Heppner residents bore no responsibility for this tragedy and that they could prevent another, and that disasters are acts of a higher hand and very unlikely to strike again. Such ambiguity probably reflected what people in Heppner were sorting out. The paper did encourage Heppner to widen the channel and make sure the banks were not congested with buildings as they had been. Both papers favored cement, brick, or stone buildings in the business district and joined the assumption that homes would prudently be constructed on higher ground, but they didn't badger. When the Gazette came out July 23, 1903, people must have been abuzz over a letter to Heppner citizens from J.W. Morrow, their former state senator. He was an early owner of the Palace Hotel, and although the flood demolished his home on Willow Creek, he still had considerable property in Heppner. Morrow wrote, "It will doubtless be difficult for the people of Heppner to gather their equilibrium, yet wisdom and duty demand a resolute and purposeful facing about and a calm survey of the future for the promise it holds." The flood made it possible, he said, to make important improvements. The original builders of Heppner encroached upon the creek with walls, buildings, and shade trees at what cost we have just seen. Morrow proposed condemning a strip 150 feet wide along Willow Creek and making it a park, with obstructions forbidden. He urged giving the ORNN the right-of-way through there for tracks to the center of town and for a depot near the courthouse. A sewerage system was, he said, an urgent need. Morrow thought owners would donate the land. "I will gladly give any land I have along the creek for any of these purposes." More, if Heppner would make these improvements, he proposed to bear any higher taxes and donate to 20 families who lost their homes 20 lots on the hill. In its response, the Gazette said, "The question of sewerage is the greatest at present. It would not be prudent at this time to put too many irons in the fire, but it would not be a bad policy for the City Council to immediately take up this question." Heppner installed other systems through future years and a modern sewerage system in 1952. Today, there are parks along the banks of Willow and Hinton Creeks just below the face of the Willow Creek Dam. The OR&N depot stayed at the end of the tracks in North Heppner until the railroad pulled out in 1988. The community did not meet the conditions Morrow set for donating his 20 lots. That would not have surprised Thomas Campanella, who teaches urban design and city planning at the University of North Carolina. Writing about the recovery of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, Campanella said, "Even if a city's buildings are toppled, property lines remain. Insurance claims and simple inertia help push landowners to rebuild more or less what they lost. There is also a deep psychological need to see things put quickly back the way they were. While a disaster can trigger a host of long-term innovations, these tend not to surface in the immediate wake of a catastrophe. Visionary schemes are the stuff of good times when people can afford the luxury of debating possible futures. The last thing people want to do in the middle of a disaster is wait around for the minutiae of a brave new plan to be refined for implementation." By early August 1903, the dominant sounds in Heppner must have been hammers, saws, and wagon wheels. Excavation was underway for the first commercial building to rise from the mud. This was Borcherer's new salon, which was to have a handsome iron front and was being built of concrete. Saddle maker George Noble will erect a one-story 20 by 80 frame building where the old building stood. J.L. Yeager's new business building, the Adams Lodging House, and many new residence buildings are being pushed to completion as fast as possible. The report a week later said, P.O. Borg this week let the contract to J.K. Carr for 2 5-room cottages. Repairs were also being made on the home of Gilbert and Cora Phelps. Plans called for the front to be decorated with a large colonial porch and a 3/4 circle bay window. That summer, the city looked into some cautionary suggestions and declined to take them. As the Gazette reported on August 13th, while a great deal has been said about building a levee or opening up and straightening the channel of Willow Creek, the stupendousness of the task has not been realized until recent investigation. It is a great task and would cost an immense sum. Nevertheless, that December, Heppner bought itself a quarter loaf. The city has done a piece of good work by having the channel of Willow Creek widened and a breakwater put in just above May Street. It would be a great safeguard if the channel were widened in various places through town. While the flood was claiming its later victims, the churches and fraternal orders, called together by Frank Gillum, were pulling together an October 15th memorial service for all who died June 14th. The committee arranged seating for 800 on what would have been the home site of Dr. Buell McSwords, scoured by floodwaters just short of 18 weeks earlier. The seats were filled and many had to stand. The program described an ecumenical service that included such hymns as Rock of Ages, Nearer My God to Thee, and Go Bury Thy Sorrow. Dr. Stephen B. L. Penrose, president of Whitman College in Walla Walla, spoke of the effect of such a disaster on the minds of men. 2 extremes, he said, might persuade survivors. One, the cry that the thing had been brought down on the people by God as a punishment for the sins of the place. The other, that there was no ruling power, neither a God of vengeance or any other God. The East Oregonian concluded, he was glad to see that no such extremes had touched the people of Heppner, but that they had turned at once to the rebuilding of their town, sobered and chastened by the catastrophe, but not disheartened. On June 16, 1904, the Heppner Times reported that a crowd of similar size gathered in the cemetery exactly 1 year after the flood. Our people, those from the surrounding county and many visitors from eastern Oregon towns, gathered in a solemn service to do honor to the memory of those who lost their lives in that great avalanche of water, the paper said. All Heppner businesses closed during the service. According to the Times, flowers and floral arrangements in very large quantities were expressed in from very many cities and towns of every section of Oregon. Beside this grand display, the flower gardens of Heppner furnished a large quantity. A procession half a mile long started at the corner of Main and May, where the Palace Hotel had stood its ground. In the lead were the lodges, followed by a large body of citizens outside the lodges, then 40 or 50 carriages. About 45 minutes later, all had reached the top of Chase Street and assembled in the cemetery. After a brief service, the mourners arranged flowers on every flood victim's grave. Resilience. Every survivor of the Heppner Flood lost someone. Many of those still alive on June 15th had seen family members or neighbors swept away, helpless to save them. Some barely escaped themselves. People who had not seen or heard the flood's rage witnessed its result the next morning and every day for 2 more weeks. Bodies bruised, torn, crushed, stripped of clothing, and too often of identifiable features. Because the water had destroyed many more family homes than businesses, the piles of debris and stretches of mud held poignant remembrance of ordinary lives for the survivors. Silverware, Bibles, mason jars, and scrapbooks. Dresses, portraits, buggies, and lamps. There was no escaping that this calamity had killed real people. Still, the inhabitants of Morrow County persevered. No community could rise more bravely under adversity, Leslie M. Scott declared in the Oregonian 4 days after the flood. Scott's colleague, A. Crofton, took note that the people go dry-eyed and silent through the streets and leave unsought the solace of tears. Right after the flood, the whole thing had seemed unreal. But over the next days and weeks, as the town began looking like Heppner again, the realization struck that this was a Heppner emptied of loved ones and familiar landmarks. Gradually, the losses must have begun feeling permanent. Sheriff E.M. Shutt said on his visit to Portland on July 9th, "The first after effect was to nerve the citizens to the task of recovering the dead and making the town habitable for the living. But now has come the reflective period, full of heartaches and grief-reviving memories." Edward Ashbaugh told the Evening Telegram in Portland, "At first I was frantic, but there was so much sorrow around me and so much to do in helping with the recovery of remains that I determined not to give way." Daniel Stalter lost his wife and 6 children right before his eyes, and he told me I was fortunate not to be there and hear the screams of drowning wife and children without being able to save them. As the days wear on, he seems to feel his loss more keenly. More than a century later, studies conducted before Hurricanes Katrina and Rita revealed that it isn't only the scale of the disaster or the intensity of the loss that determine how a survivor recovers from catastrophe. A person's worldview, practiced coping skills, and self-confidence can determine whether he or she is crippled by the trauma or can bounce back. And what matters, apparently, is not how individuals actually cope, but rather how they perceive their capabilities to cope, as Fran Norris of Dartmouth Medical School wrote in a review of the research. The studies found that self-efficacy, mastery, perceived control, self-esteem, hope, and optimism are all related positively, strongly, and consistently to mental health. That list sounds like the attributes people around Heppner brought to their disaster. Frontier families, routinely faced with adversity, had endless opportunities to figure out how to overcome it, and in their process to develop assurance of their own capacities. Most Heppner flood survivors had already mourned the loss of children, spouses, parents, and friends. Perceived control? If a person couldn't control a flash flood, he could control how he responded to it, and the self-reliant people of Morrow County were accustomed to routinely mastering everything they could. Morrow County was inhabited by optimists. Hope is what brought farmers, ranchers, and families across the continent to Oregon. They probably taught their children to expect good outcomes. Though some survivors must have had their trust shaken by the deaths of so many innocents, a majority of the survivors in this small town with its 6 churches called upon their religious faith in the months and years after the flood. Practically speaking, Heppner's underlying prosperity helped restore housing, jobs, and household budgets, unlike in the situation in New Orleans, where the victims were more likely to be poor people who didn't have the means to evacuate. The flood in Heppner killed people of every income level and obliterated the most expensive homes along with more modest dwellings. Rebuilding, of course, provided gainful employment. When the people of Heppner devoted themselves to the community's urgent tasks, that action likely had beneficial effects beyond restoring the town itself. Researchers Charles Benight and Albert Bandura found proactive coping reduces the likelihood of longer-term distress. Resilience, the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, is in fact not the exception, but ordinary, according to the American Psychological Association Help Center, and involves behaviors, thoughts, and actions that can be learned and developed in anyone. Which might explain how Ed Ashbaugh went on with his life. At age 36, he lost more family to the flood than anyone else. His wife, all of his children, 6 daughters and 1 son, his sister and brother-in-law, 2 nieces and 2 nephews, his aunt, 2 cousins, and even a second cousin. Ed sold his temperance pastime business, billiards, pool, and cards, no liquor, and went to Portland briefly in the months after June 14th, resigning his position as county commissioner September 2nd, 1903, 1 week before his father, 75-year-old Andrew Ashbaugh, died in Heppner. Ed returned to Heppner in early 1904, buying back the business and staying 2 more years. He married May Blanche Burnett of Grants Pass in October 1905 and moved permanently to Portland in 1906. Blanche died in 1934, and 2 years later he married Lena Smith. Ed worked until he was 80, first operating a cigar store in a Portland hotel, later traveling for a wholesale tobacco firm for 14 years. He retired in 1947 after years working at the State Armory in Portland. Ed had a stroke in 1949 and was not able to walk again. He was 86 when he died in Portland on October 20th, 1953. But earlier that year, in May, he had told his story to Ora M. Yeager, the Heppner historian, who got it published in the Gazette-Times on June 10th, 1965, 12 years later. In that account, Ed revealed details that must have made the unthinkable loss of his wife and children even more difficult. He spoke of having to identify bodies that were apparently so disfigured that he couldn't be certain. He had been in Portland in his role as Morrow County Commissioner on June 14th and told Yeager, "When I got home, I tried to find some of their bodies. I never found my son for sure, but we buried a boy of about the same age and put up a tombstone, but I was never sure. We had a baby 1 month old, but never found her." He didn't recognize Cora except for the initials inside her wedding band. As for the child identified by the cobbler who recognized her new shoes, "I buried her as if I knew for sure she was mine. I am still not satisfied that she was mine. It seems a long time since the terrible flood, yet sometimes it seems only yesterday. Even to this day, I can't tell how I stood the terrible ordeal." The disaster studies would have predicted that Edward Cannon Ashbaugh was likely to recover as well as a person could. Since he was a farmer, Ed must have been an optimist who had mastered a long list of challenges. It took self-esteem to run for county commissioner, which he did successfully in 1902. He spoke with confidence, telling the Gazette for its January 1st, 1903 supplement, "I landed in 8 Mile 14 years ago with 35 cents in my pocket. Land at that time in this district had little or no value. I traded a $30 cayuse horse for a man's right on 320 acres of land. This I got from the government. 3 years ago, I bargained for another half section, giving 3,000 bushels of wheat for it. I sowed the land and raised the wheat in 2 years." After the flood, Ed took control of finding and identifying the bodies of his wife and children. The APA report on resilience emphasizes the value of caring and supportive relationships. Though Ed Ashbaugh's family had been lost, he told the Portland Evening Telegram after the flood that he expected to remain in Heppner, where there are so many bereaved ones, they serve to console each other. Then he added, "My friends advised me to go away for a while and seek relief from change of scene, but I shall return in a few days as there is much work for the County Court of Commissioners to do in repairing damages and providing for the bereaved ones who need assistance." Of course, not every survivor of the Heppner flood had the combination of experiences and beliefs needed to create resilience. Some must have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder decades before it was named. People with PTSD experience a numbing of emotions, intrusive memories, and the need to avoid reminders of the traumatic event, irritability, and hypervigilance. PTSD can affect virtually all people who have had intimate or prolonged contact with the catastrophe, meaning it can also plague rescuers, those survivors who had close calls, and witnesses. 4 to 5% of natural disaster survivors develop PTSD. The roles men and women were expected to play in 1903 cannot have made it easier to bounce back. One of a man's duties was to protect his family. That was evident between the lines in a story in the June 19th Oregonian. Mrs. Gunn's 4 children escaped. The husband warned the family of danger. All ran from the house, the children first, the father next, the mother last. Gunn looked back as he went out of the yard. He saw his wife fall in a faint. He returned to save her, and both perished. And Mrs. John Woodward, whose body came to light today, is survived by 3 children and her husband. The man would have rescued her, but a stubborn gate barred their frantic flight from the front yard. On June 18th, the Oregonian had reported, "Tom Matlock held on to his wife as long as he could. He never saw her again after she slipped from him." That day's Oregonian carried an 8-level headline that began, "Hunt for Dead," and continued, "Mournful task still goes on," and then, "Workers all weary." The next line read, "But they manfully do their sad duty." Acting manfully apparently was understood to involve toughness, stoicism, and dutiful work. With few exceptions, mothers died with their children. When a mother lived and her child perished, the story was nearly always the same. The child was torn from her arms. There's no reason to doubt that, but news stories about young women routinely focused on and often imagined their mothering. At least 4 women were said to have given birth in the floodwaters. Their newborns were not found or never identified. Most others of childbearing age were said to be expecting. In this pre-birth control era, that too was entirely possible. Men were protectors. Women were nurturing mothers. Only a supernatural force could overcome either. So the adults in Heppner were offended when the report of U.S. Geological Survey engineer John T. Whistler appeared in the East Oregonian June 23rd and described a force much weaker than the one they had been asked to resist. By the time the East Oregonian's June 29th edition came out, witnesses had rejected Whistler's contention that the wall of water that led the rampage was only 15 feet high. They also couldn't believe the water had only been 5 feet deep where houses were obliterated. The La Grande Chronicle and Observer, the Baker City Democrat, the Boise, Idaho Evening Capital News and Grant County News, the Walla Walla Statesman, and the Dallas Times Mountaineer all challenged Whistler for extremely conservative estimates. The East Oregonian counseled respect. Mr. Whistler's measurements, surveys, and cross-sections of the creek and the track of the flood are based on indisputable scientific processes. The area of the storm and the concentration of water in the Balm Creek Canyon can be proven by the traces it left behind. And the paper argued that Whistler's calculations were consistent with the flood every bit as horrific as survivors thought. The amount of water that passed through town was equal to a volume 1 foot deep over 1,100 acres. This amounts to 58,872,000 cubic feet, or 3,532,320,000 pounds of water. It was not the depth of the water that wrought the havoc, it seems, but the awful weight of the volume and the velocity it had gained by the time it reached Heppner. Those who witnessed the flood say the entire volume passed a given point in Heppner in 50 minutes, which would mean that over 70 million pounds of water per minute passed through town, traveling at 12 miles per hour at that point. When Whistler's analysis was published in Engineering News on July 16th, he reassured Heppner, "The facts can in no way detract from or belittle the awfulness of the disaster." But speaking as an investigator, he thought it interesting that witnesses gave unquestionably honest but just as unquestionably inconsistent and exaggerated statements. Exaggerated or not, the dramatic experiences of witnesses are valuable both as a part of the whole truth and as illustrations of the terror the water created. Survivors' estimates differ because the water was chaotic and witnesses saw its fury at different places and from many angles. There are no records that tell whether the people of Heppner were ever satisfied that Whistler's estimates matched what they experienced. It is too bad that the only scientific study of the flood does not address two factors: the presence of the Heppner steam laundry, which acted as a dam, and the way the Star rooming house protected the Palace Hotel. Nowhere in his Engineering News report does Whistler indicate he knew of the laundry. The water's power as it entered Heppner told others that a dam had broken, and the laundry in all probability had performed as a dam. Whistler's estimates of the water's depth inside Heppner were informed by there being no water inside the palace. He notes that the flood deposited another building against the palace, but does not account for the effect described by palace guest N.L. Tooker in the June 17th Oregon Journal. The Star formed a breakwater that kept the palace dry while people, machines, and buildings were being carried away just beyond the walls of the rooming house. Would Whistler have offered different measures of velocity and depth if he had known about the laundry and the circumstances that spared the palace? Probably, but his account is still useful, particularly because it shows that water does not have to be very fast or very deep to crush everything in its way. The USGS report may or may not have affected survivors' recovery, but the speed of cleanup and rebuilding in Heppner probably did. A survey on the National Institute of Mental Health's website underscores the negative impact of the slow pace of recovery on Katrina-affected communities and survivors. NIMH said Katrina survivors' mental health had in fact worsened 2 years after the August 2005 hurricane, which runs counter to the typical pattern of recovery after a natural disaster, in which the prevalence of mental disorders among the survivors gradually decreases and fades out after about 2 years.
Go!
Counter effects. Just a little less than 60 years after the Heppner Flood, Morrow County residents crowded into Heppner Elementary School for a formal public hearing on the latest proposal for a flood-controlled dam. It was January 14th, 1963, and as the citizens weighed in, they described some of what had already been done, and in doing so also revealed the long-term impact of June 14th, 1903. The Army Corps of Engineers conducted the hearing. Al Lamb, then mayor of Heppner, favored the dam. Since 1903, Heppner has been under the shadow of a repeat performance of this tragedy. Our luck cannot be expected to always hold. In addition, time creates carelessness, with the result that again our small city is so bunched and situated as to be the victim of a like flood should one develop. W.T. Rosewall, chair of the Morrow County Planning and Zoning Commission, said the commission supported the dam partly because it will be a real pleasure to go to bed at night knowing that your life and property will not be destroyed before you awaken. It will do away with a life of fear. One opponent of the dam, veterinarian James W. Noreen, argued that Willow Creek was no longer speckled with pig pens and spotted with barns and laced with corrals for the family milk cow and carriage horses. He noted that the channel was very largely cleared of brush and trees and obstructions and was now a very efficient mechanism. R. Stephen Thompson, the only rancher who would lose his property to the reservoir, pointed out that the proposed dam, controlling Willow Creek and Balm Fork, offered no protection from floods on Hinton or Shobe. He maintained that the creek channel south of Heppner had been cleaned and widened and straightened to a large degree. The proposal on the table would satisfy flood control, supplemental water supply for irrigated lands, recreation, wildlife, and sports fishing, according to Colonel J.H. Beddow, the Corps' Walla Walla district engineer. Beddow said the Corps had evaluated other ideas, large channels through Heppner and Lexington, moving Heppner up on the hill, and rejected each for serving only one need, and at costs too high for the benefit. He emphasized, cloudburst floods have very high peak discharges and require large capacity flood control channels or costly dams. Heppner, well, some of Heppner had been seeking federal flood control for decades. Congress had first asked the Corps to study flooding in the Willow Creek drainage in 1937, right after the Flood Control Act of 1936 had established federal flood protection led by the Corps. The Corps recommended a dam in 1945, but lack of local support and national economic conditions kept it on the shelf. In 1958, new Morrow County Judge Oscar Peterson made securing a dam a primary focus of his work, and the Corps was asked for a new study. The Flood Control Act of 1965 authorized a dam on Willow Creek. President Gerald Ford vetoed one proposal in 1974, and 2 years later, when a Corps representative came to Heppner with a scaled-back project, everyone at the town meeting opposed any dam. Proponents in Heppner did not give up, and Morrow County commissioners made several official expeditions to Washington, D.C. Prospects changed when Oregon Senator Marco Hatfield got behind the idea. Willow Creek Dam was in the Public Works Appropriations Bill before Congress in 1978, which was approved by President Jimmy Carter. The contract was awarded to the Yukon Corporation on November 5, 1981. 3 Heppner City Councilmen, Bob Jones, Larry Mills, and Cliff Green, voted to support the dam solely to free up construction inside the area that the Federal Emergency Management Agency had designated as floodplain, which ran through the middle of Heppner. Green, mayor when the dam was dedicated, believed the 100-year floodplain boundaries, with their freeze-on development and replacement, were more dangerous to the future of downtown Heppner than a flood. Willow Creek Dam would control the 2 creeks primarily responsible for the flood of June 14, 1903. But the people who were supposed to benefit were divided. In advisory notes in 1979 and 1981, the majority favored the dam, but only by narrow margins. 58 and 52%. The Corps chose to build the dam of roller compacted concrete, a durable paving material that carries heavy loads. Some in Heppner thought the Corps was mainly aiming to save money. It was going to be the first RCC dam in the United States, which added a guinea pig factor to Heppner's fears. Willow Creek Dam cost $36 million. It took only 16 months to build, one reason RCC is cheaper, and began filling in February 1983. On April 8, 1982, Gazette-Times readers had seen a picture of the Thompson family home being moved into town 10 months before that ranch would disappear beneath Willow Creek Lake. Though the Corps had stressed that it wasn't building the dam to reduce FEMA restrictions through town, that happened anyway. The dam was dedicated on July 23, 1983, in ceremonies held right next to where a churning wall of gray-brown water had struck Heppner 80 years and 39 days earlier. About 200 people gathered in a new city park below the face of the dam to hear Senator Hatfield declare that the dam was there because the most important thing of all is the preservation of human life. At 160 feet high and 1,780 feet wide, Willow Creek Dam is huge, imposing, and ugly or elegant depending on your perspective on dams. It is, hands down, the most visible reminder of the Heppner Flood. Floods have been recorded in or near Heppner in 1883, 1885, 1888, 1891, 1903, 1904, 1917, 1918, 1920, 1934, 1961, 1965, 1969, 1971, and 1979. Thunderstorms caused every one of them, although what caused the 1883 flood is still a mystery, and the water in 1979 came from snowmelt. The 1903 catastrophe is the only lethal flood on record. Nevertheless, experts have taken special note of flash floods in 1934 and 1971. The May 29, 1934 flood mimicked the flood 31 years earlier by roaring down Balm Fork and into Willow Creek and Heppner, but it also poured through Ray Creek. The Corps measured it at 13,000 cubic feet per second, a little more than a third as powerful as the 36,000 cubic feet per second calculated for June 14, 1903. Then, 37 years later, on May 25, 1971, floodwaters swept into Heppner down Shobe Canyon and dumped water and mud through town. The Corps calculated that event at 6,000 cubic feet per second. No single thing, not even a flood-control dam, will protect Heppner from another murderous flood. Thus, over the last century, Heppner has been resisting disaster with thousands of initiatives, minuscule to gigantic, governmental and private. 2 years after the flood, a band of bare dirt still spread from both banks of Willow Creek all the way through Heppner. When the map makers of the Sanborn Map Company returned to Heppner in June 1905, they drew a community different from the one they had recorded 18 months before the Heppner flood. Their map indicates that people walking or riding near the path of the flood would now be struck mostly by absence. Homes and other structures that had arranged themselves along Willow Creek were missing like the summit of Mount St. Helens, and the World Trade Center towers would be missing 77 and 98 years later. It was a long scar. At least temporarily, June 14th taught Heppner to stay away from the banks of a creek that can suddenly turn murderous. Today, houses stand in that strip, though apparently not so close to the water as they had been in 1903. The dam makes their location safer, but long before the dam was built, smaller flood prevention measures had become routine. At some point, for instance, it became antisocial and then illegal to put a fence across the creek. And despite the widespread belief that creeks are perfect trash receptacles, people learned that trash and brush should not be granted precious space in the creek channel. The city's own website instructs citizens about the Heppner floodplain. Every piece of trash contributes to flooding, and warns that both the federal government and the city enforce prohibitions against dumping. The Heppner Water Control District conducts an annual cleanup of the creek. Youth organizations and parents join in. The floods since 1903 have in fact been catalysts for prevention. After 1934, civilian Conservation Corps crews came to Heppner in June and October 1935 and cleared the creeks. An alert system established after the 1965 flood has ranchers notifying the city of sudden or major storms. In time for the 1969 flash flood down Shobe, a system triggered by a designated level of rainwater or stream flow set sirens blaring. In Heppner, a horn sounds for fire, a siren means flood. After 1971, the Corps deepened and widened the Willow Creek Channel, and the U.S. Soil Conservation Service dug 30 miles of diversion ditches into the sides of the hills south of Heppner. The ditches, now visible throughout the Willow Creek and Balm Fork drainages, run horizontally along the hillsides, each creating a surface 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep, and designed to keep rainwater from cascading straight to the bottom of the canyon. The ditches are planted in grass. The 1971 flood also spurred formation of the Women's Volunteer Flood Control Committee. The women of Heppner collected money to buy farmland and turn it permanently to grass, or to help farmers pay for that conservation on their hilltop acres. The women could also notify others within minutes and help elderly people get to high ground. Later, too, taxpayers created a water district to maintain a rip-wrapped channel for water from Shobe. In fact, Morrow County Emergency Management Director Casey F. Byrd says Willow Creek Dam is only a small part of what's been done to keep the community safer. He points to the subtler contributions of diversion ditches and the Federal Conservation Reserve Program. Both have kept tons of rainwater from rushing down steep canyon walls to create flash floods. Today, 24 agencies in Oregon and Morrow County participate in elaborate plans to give people time to escape a 1903 caliber flood. Unlike their ancestors on June 14, 1903, the residents of Heppner now have the benefit of Doppler radar, human weather spotters, dozens of rain and stream gauges, and redundant communications, monitoring networks, and automated notification systems. And importantly, emergency responders following a familiar strategy. The best evidence of Heppner's defense against a murderous flood was laid out in a day-long drill on July 18, 2006, in the Morrow County Emergency Management Operations Room on the hill above northwest Heppner. Planning in real time. The participants and one observer are here for a tabletop exercise to evaluate the new Heppner flash flood emergency plan. 24 women and men are seated around a room equipped with screens that will display maps, lists, and data from the computers in adjoining rooms and from participants' laptops. Emergency Management Director Byrd directs the exercise for the city. Today's task is to respond to an event like June 14, 1903. Because the dam regulates Willow and Balm, the drill hypothesizes a flood from Shobe Canyon, the route of the 1969 and 1971 floods. Byrd expects the exercise to demonstrate the importance of every function in the room, as well as the value of better predictive capabilities. The plan works through 5 threat levels, and the goal is to get everyone at risk to high ground before level 5. Bob Ford of the Corps of Engineers Operations Center in the Dalles calls a map to the screen and points out the rain and stream gauges spread over Willow Creek Basin. The sensors feed information continuously to emergency responders. The National Weather Service announces a severe thunderstorm watch for Morrow and Umatilla counties. Minutes later, the Weather Service reports Doppler radar is tracking 2 storm cells moving northeast at 30 miles an hour. Weather spotters also have them in sight. The Weather Service upgrades the situation to a severe storm warning. Morrow County can expect high winds, heavy rain, and frequent lightning. Says Byrd, "This is when you get your plans out. The Weather Service predicts the storm will pass over Heppner or just east of town. The Corps calls. They are elevating the threat to level 2. Heppner Fire Chief Rusty Estes is notified. In the National Incident Management System, every emergency has one commander. In Heppner, Estes is in charge. The Morrow County 911 Dispatch Center sees alarming rainfall. The threat rises to level 3. This step activates the Incident Command System and the Emergency Operations Center. Commander Estes sends officers to checkpoints to observe the floodplains. The Corps' flood warning system uses tipping cups to track rainfall in the hills and mountains. When water in a cup gets to a designated level, the cup tips and signals the monitors. But, as Byrd points out, the apparatus makes a great scratching post for animals. Birds like to make nests in them, so when a warning comes in, officers are dispatched in part to make sure the threat signal was not set off by critters. Weather spotters and Doppler are watching. At level 3, the county emergency dispatcher and the Corps dispatcher get more aggressive, making calls, gearing up. Byrd is notified. If it is after hours, all on-call emergency employees are notified to report to the Emergency Management Center to be on standby. Estes calls an all-department meeting. Hinton Creek is out of its banks and there's water in Shobe. Then there's a foot of water in Shobe. Schools are notified if they are in session. City Manager David R. DeMeo says the city should be alerted at level 3, earlier than the plan requires. Linda Curtis of the American Red Cross office in Pendleton also asks to be notified then. St. Patrick's Senior Center on Main Street is a 3-story brick building with 19 apartments. Byrd says the plan assumes the building will withstand a flood, partly because buildings south of St. Patrick's will absorb some of the water's force. So, they believe it will be safer to move residents to the upper floors than to evacuate them via city streets. The community evacuation plan is counting on feet, says Byrd. In Heppner, most citizens are at most a few hundred yards from high ground. The storm has intensified. The threat rises to level 4. The Sheriff's Department 911 dispatcher pushes a button and the flash flood sirens alert Heppner citizens to run immediately to the nearest high ground. Then they are to make their way to the rallying point for their section of town. Dispatch also activates an automatic telephone calling list, notifying all agencies that monitor the Sheriff's Department radio frequencies, including radio and telephone paging systems and volunteer fire departments in Lexington and Ione. The list includes the County Public Works Department, State Department of Transportation, emergency management agencies in adjoining counties, the State Departments of Health for drinking water and environmental quality, and KUMA radio in Pendleton, which will activate the emergency alert system. This is not only a test. Byrd decides level 4 should be 4 to 5 minutes earlier because sirens are harder to hear with thunder, lightning, and hail. And because between 4, when the sirens sound, and 5, people need to get 20 feet above the floodplain. When level 5 is declared, anyone not on high ground is lost. He also wants to do more at level 3. When you get to 4, there's not a lot of time left. In addition to sirens, a scroll across local cable TV screen says, "Immediately head to high ground." The Oregon State Police and County Sheriff are notified to block traffic on roads and highways leading into drainages that might flood, as Byrd puts it, to keep people from driving themselves into risk. Ford declares level 5. There is water in every Willow Creek drainage. It's more than 5 feet deep in Shobe. Though the velocity will fall when it gets to town, the water is moving at 40 to 50 miles per hour. The creeks are filled with vehicles, dead animals, and other debris. Willow Creek Dam is capturing floodwater in the Willow Creek and Balm Fork drainages, and the lake behind the dam is rising. Ranches south of the lake may be flooded. When the lake gets full, the dam will begin releasing impounded water. With controlled releases, land use measures, and cleared channels, the outflow should be more gradual. It is vital for the city, then the county, to declare an emergency and then ask the state to do so. If the county declares an emergency, the city can use county resources. When the state declares an emergency, the county can use state resources. These are extensive and might include Air National Guard helicopters, potable water, portable toilets, mortuary services, and state health department help with hepatitis vaccines and immune globulin, as well as Department of Environmental Quality guidance on where to dump flood-contaminated debris. The water in Shobe Canyon is 9 feet deep. Byrd assumes phones are out and at least part of the power grid. The sewer system has failed, and first responders are walking in sewage, where there might also be live electrical wires. Estes asks, "Do we want to kill all power?" Curtis says the Red Cross will register people who come to the mass care shelter the agency is setting up at Heppner High School, also on this hilltop. The Red Cross has a trailer near Heppner filled with supplies for a 100-cot shelter and more supplies in Pilot Rock and Pendleton. Oregon Emergency Management calls for an update. Estes assembles his team and reports heavy destruction, highways inaccessible, telephone system down, sewer gone, people missing, maybe killed or injured. Right away, they need help getting roads reopened to allow equipment and assistance into the scene. Oregon Highway 74 runs right through the middle of Heppner. The Oregon Department of Transportation will get on it. Search and rescue begins as soon as the flood surge has passed. Recovery comes next, locating and extracting the remains of any casualties, opening Highway 74 by cleaning debris and installing temporary bridges as required, mitigating identified hazards to recovery workers, addressing public health concerns, and restoring infrastructure. The critical difference between 1903 and today is that warnings will be sounded in time for people to escape. Though some scrambled to safety on June 14, 1903, most who died heard no warning or, when they saw it, couldn't run faster than the flood. Nearly everyone in Heppner learned about the Heppner Flood when it was already at level 5. And people in Heppner and Morrow County have taken thousands of steps to inhibit the effect of future floods. Local, state, and federal governments have established their own mitigation measures and requirements, and the dam now controls the creeks mainly responsible for the 1903 flood. The 2006 emergency drill demonstrated the capacities of all kinds of agencies working with tools no one could have imagined in 1903. It is tempting to say their drill predicted that no flood can kill 245 people in this county again. Tempting except for two things: nature and human beings. History keeps reminding us that nature still has the last word. And as Byrd put it, getting people educated about what to do is a never-ending challenge. New people visit or move to town. Some residents have satellite television and won't see the crawlers on cable. We keep ourselves distracted like never before. The humans Heppner's emergency plan is intended to save may be listening not to the sirens, but to whatever is coming through their earphones. Most of the people who died on June 14, 1903, could not hear the flood approaching. The roar of the storm masked the pandemonium of the flood, and they had resorted to the 1903 equivalent of wearing earphones. They had gone inside and closed the doors and windows. Even the smallest things we do have consequences.